I'm Elena Kovac, and I never imagined that restoring a single Victorian mansion would turn into owning the most exclusive restoration architecture firm on the East Coast. My husband David spent 7 years introducing me to his wealthy family as someone who does interior design work, never mentioning that I'm the woman who saved 12 historic landmarks from demolition and transformed them into architectural treasures worth millions. When his sister Caroline announced her engagement party at the prestigious Whitmore estate, I was excited to finally meet the extended family, until I discovered David had told them I couldn't attend because of a work conflict I never had. What he didn't know was that the Whitmore estate wasn't just any venue. It was my latest acquisition, a crumbling 1890s mansion I'd spent 2 years and $3 million restoring from near collapse, and I held the deed in my name alone. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My path into architectural restoration began almost by accident, the way most great love affairs do. Fresh out of graduate school with a degree in architectural history, I took a research position at the State Historic Preservation Office, thinking it would be a stepping stone to something more glamorous. Instead, I found my calling among the dusty archives and forgotten blueprints of buildings everyone else had written off as lost causes. There was something profoundly moving about these structures, each one a tangible connection to the past, filled with the stories of people who had lived, worked, and dreamed within their walls. My supervisor, an elderly architect named Thomas Brennan who had spent 40 years fighting to save historic buildings, recognized something in me that I hadn't yet seen in myself. Elena, he told me one rainy afternoon as we stood in the shell of an abandoned firehouse scheduled for demolition, most people see these old buildings as obstacles to progress. You see them as possibilities. That's not something I can teach. Within 2 years, I had moved from researcher to project coordinator, working alongside Thomas on restoration proposals that combined historical accuracy with modern functionality. I learned to read buildings the way some people read books, understanding their original intent, their modifications over time, their structural weaknesses and hidden strengths. Every calloused brick and warped floorboard told a story, and I became fluent in their language. When Thomas retired, he did something that shocked everyone in the preservation community. He handed me the keys to his private workshop, a converted carriage house filled with decades of architectural salvage, original blueprints, and restoration tools, along with a handwritten note that simply said, "Don't let them tear down our history." That workshop became my sanctuary and eventually the birthplace of Kovac restoration architecture. My first independent project was a modest queen and cottage that a developer had planned to demolish for a parking lot. I mortgaged everything I owned, maxed out every credit card, and bought the property for barely more than the land value. Everyone thought I was insane, including my parents, who couldn't understand why their daughter with 2 degrees was choosing to pour her savings into a rotting house in a declining neighborhood. But I saw what they couldn't. Beneath the water damage and decades of neglect, the cottage had exquisite original details, hand-carved woodwork, stained glass windows, decorative plasterwork that modern craftsmen couldn't replicate at any price. I spent 18 months learning to do much of the restoration work myself, stripping paint at 3 a.m, teaching myself traditional plastering techniques from century-old manuals, hunting through architectural salvage yards for period-appropriate fixtures. When I finally sold that cottage, fully restored to its 1895 glory, I made enough profit to buy 2 more endangered properties. Those 2 became 4, then 4 became 8, each one teaching me new skills and building my reputation in the preservation community. The Whitmore estate came into my life 3 years ago, and it was by far my most ambitious undertaking. The property had been abandoned for nearly 20 years, a victim of family disputes, unpaid taxes, and the astronomical cost of maintaining a 15,000 square foot mansion. Local preservation groups had fought to save it, but without serious capital and expertise, the building continued its slow collapse. When I first walked through it, accompanied by a structural engineer who kept shaking his head and muttering about load-bearing walls, I felt the same electric thrill I'd experienced in that first cottage. The Whitmore wasn't just a building. It was a masterpiece of Victorian architecture, designed by a prominent architect of the era, with details that had somehow survived decades of neglect. The purchase negotiation took 6 months, complicated by liens and legal disputes among the previous owner's heirs. I paid far more than the property's assessed value, but far less than what it would be worth once restored. The renovation consumed the next 2 years of my life. I assembled a team of craftsmen who specialized in historical restoration, tracked down original blueprints at the County Historical Society, and personally oversaw every detail from the reproduction of custom moldings to the historically accurate color palette for each room. There were times when the scope of the project felt overwhelming, when structural problems we hadn't anticipated threatened to derail everything, when my budget projections proved wildly optimistic and I had to secure additional financing using my other properties as collateral. But slowly, painstakingly, the Whitmore estate returned to life. The grand ballroom with its 20-foot ceilings and original crystal chandeliers became a space of breathtaking elegance. The library with its floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and hidden reading nooks regained its warmth and intimacy. The gardens, which I'd hired a historical landscape architect to restore to their 1890s glory, bloomed again after decades of wilderness. When the restoration was finally complete, the Whitmore estate became the crown jewel of my portfolio, a venue that attracted attention from architectural magazines, preservation societies, and event planners seeking something truly special. I didn't advertise it widely, preferring to maintain its exclusive status, but word spread among those who appreciated historical authenticity combined with modern luxury. I met David at a fundraising gala for the local historical society 4 years ago. He worked in wealth management at his father's firm, not particularly passionate about his career but competent and comfortable in the world of old money and social connections. There was an easy charm about him that drew me in after years of focusing exclusively on my business. He seemed genuinely interested in my work, asking thoughtful questions about restoration techniques and the challenges of preserving historical integrity while meeting modern building codes. Our courtship moved quickly, perhaps too quickly in retrospect, and we were engaged within 8 months. The first warning sign came when he introduced me to his parents, Richard and Margaret Whitfield, at their country club for Sunday brunch. The Whitfields were exactly what you'd expect from a family whose wealth dated back 4 generations, polished manners masking casual condescension, particularly toward anyone they perceived as beneath their social standing. David introduced me as Elena. She works in interior design and historic properties, a description so vague it was almost meaningless. I started to clarify, to explain that I own my own restoration firm, that I'd saved multiple landmarks from demolition, but David squeezed my hand under the table in a gesture I would come to know well. A silent request to let his incomplete introduction stand. His mother Margaret smiled with practiced politeness and said, "How lovely, historic properties must be such a nice hobby," emphasizing the word hobby in a way that made it clear she considered my career insignificant compared to the real business of wealth management that the Whitfield men engaged in. I should have corrected her immediately, should have insisted on being seen fully for who I was and what I'd built. Instead, I told myself that first impressions were complicated, that I would have time to show them the scope of my work, that David would eventually feel secure enough to share my accomplishments with pride. That temporary accommodation hardened into our normal pattern over the following years. We married in a ceremony at the Whitfield family estate, a sprawling property that had been in their family for 3 generations. Even on our wedding day, the announcements and toasts referred to me in the vaguest possible terms as a woman interested in old buildings, as if my career were a quirky pastime rather than a thriving business. I told myself it didn't matter, that I knew my own worth even if David's family didn't understand it. But each dismissive comment, each time David failed to correct their misperceptions, each introduction that diminished my work, chipped away at my sense of self within our marriage. The pattern continued and calcified over our 7 years together. At family dinners, when conversation turned to business, the men would discuss investment strategies and market trends while I was relegated to conversations with the women about charity events and interior decorating. When I tried to participate in the business discussions, David would gently redirect the conversation, or worse, explain basic financial concepts to me as if I hadn't been successfully running a multi-million-dollar enterprise for years. When my restoration of a historic courthouse won a prestigious preservation award, David suggested we skip the ceremony because it conflicted with his mother's birthday dinner, a casual family gathering that happened every year and could easily have been rescheduled. I began to notice how carefully David controlled the information his family received about my career. When his sister Caroline asked about my work, he would describe it in terms that made me sound like a freelance decorator who occasionally consulted on old houses. When business associates asked about my firm, he would change the subject or minimize my role. Once, at a dinner party, someone mentioned they had seen an article about my restoration of the historic Morrison Theatre, and David actually claimed he didn't know I'd been involved in that project, despite the fact that I'd spent 18 months consumed by it and had celebrated with him when it was completed. The lies and omissions accumulated like water damage in an old building, invisible at first but steadily weakening the foundation of our relationship. I told myself I was being understanding of his insecurities, that I was choosing harmony over ego. But in truth, I was allowing myself to be diminished, shrinking to fit into the narrow space David's discomfort had created for me. The worst part was how it began to affect my own sense of identity. I started downplaying my successes even when David wasn't present, became hesitant to talk about my projects, felt a strange shame about my accomplishments that I knew was completely irrational but couldn't seem to shake. When David's sister Caroline got engaged to Preston Montgomery, heir to a commercial real estate fortune, the wedding planning became the sole focus of family gatherings for months. Caroline had her mother's taste for ostentation and her father's unlimited budget, a combination that resulted in increasingly elaborate plans for what she called the social event of the season. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She wanted a venue that would impress Preston's family and their extensive social circle, somewhere with historical significance and architectural beauty that would photograph well for the society pages and social media. After touring a dozen venues and finding fault with each one, she became fixated on the Whitmore estate. I was in my office reviewing construction documents for my newest acquisition when David called with the news. Caroline found the perfect venue, he said, excitement evident in his voice. The Whitmore estate, have you heard of it? It's this incredible Victorian mansion that was just restored. She's absolutely in love with it. I sat very still, phone pressed to my ear, waiting for him to make the connection. The Whitmore estate was featured in Architectural Digest last month, I said carefully. Did you see that article? I skimmed it, he admitted. You know I'm not really into that historical architecture stuff. But Caroline showed me photos and it's really something. She's already reached out to their event coordinator. Their event coordinator was my director of operations, a woman named Patricia who had worked with me for 5 years and knew exactly who owned the property. I wondered if David would recognize my involvement when Caroline began making arrangements, if he would finally see me in my full professional capacity. Instead, over the following weeks, I listened to Caroline and David's mother plan every detail of the engagement party without any acknowledgement of my connection to the venue. When I gently mentioned that I was familiar with the Whitmore estate, Margaret dismissed my comment with a wave of her hand, saying everyone in the city had heard of it now that it was fashionable again. The engagement party was scheduled for a Saturday evening in late spring, prime season for events at the Whitmore. I marked the date in my calendar and began coordinating with Patricia to ensure everything would be flawless. Caroline's demands were extensive and specific, from the flower arrangements to the lighting design to the vintage champagne she wanted served. Each request came through the official channels to Patricia, who then consulted with me privately about feasibility and cost. I approved everything, even the modifications that pushed the boundaries of our standard packages, because despite everything, Caroline was family and I wanted her celebration to be memorable. 3 weeks before the party, I noticed something odd in our shared family calendar. The engagement party date was marked, but my name wasn't included in the attendee list. I assumed it was an oversight, perhaps a synchronization error with the digital calendar. When I mentioned it to David that evening, he barely looked up from his laptop. About that, he said, still focused on his screen. There's been a change of plans with the guest list. A change, I repeated, something cold settling in my stomach. Caroline and Preston are keeping it smaller than originally planned, he explained, finally meeting my eyes. Just immediate family and Preston's parents. They need to cut about 20 people from the list. I stared at him, not quite believing what I was hearing. And I'm one of the 20 being cut? He had the decency to look uncomfortable. It's not personal, Elena. You know how these things are. Preston's family is very traditional about what constitutes immediate family, and since you and Caroline aren't particularly close anyway. We've been married for 7 years, I said, my voice tight. I'm your wife. How is that not immediate family? Look, it's complicated, he said, closing his laptop with an air of finality. The venue has strict capacity limits and Caroline needs to prioritize Preston's business associates and his extended family. You understand about capacity limits, right? Given your work? The irony of him using my expertise in my own property against me nearly made me laugh. The Whitmore Ballroom could comfortably hold 200 people for a seated dinner. Caroline's guest list was barely over 100. Capacity wasn't the issue. I knew the real reason, though David would never say it directly. In his family's eyes, I wasn't important enough to warrant one of those carefully allocated spots. I was the wife with the quaint little career, not someone whose presence added value to their social calculations. This is my decision, I said quietly. I'm not asking your permission, David. I'm your wife, and I should be at your sister's engagement party. He sighed, the sound filled with frustration. Why do you have to make everything difficult? This is Caroline's special day. Can't you just be supportive and not create drama? The accusation stung. In all our years together, I had bent myself into impossible shapes to be supportive, had swallowed countless dismissals and minimizations without complaint, had allowed my professional identity to be erased in the service of his family's comfort. And now I was being accused of creating drama for having the audacity to expect to be included in a family event. Fine, I said, my voice carefully neutral. If that's how you feel, I won't create drama. David seemed relieved, clearly interpreting my acquiescence as agreement. Thank you for understanding. I'll make it up to you, maybe we can have a nice dinner that weekend, just the two of us. I didn't respond, just nodded and left the room before he could see the tears of anger and hurt burning in my eyes. In my home office, I pulled up the event contract for Caroline's party. Every detail she had requested was documented, every upgrade and special accommodation carefully noted. My signature was on the contract as the property owner, though she had probably never noticed that detail, assuming Elena Kovac was just another staff member at the venue. The next morning, I called Patricia into my private office at the Whitmore estate. The historic mansion looked particularly beautiful in the morning light, sunbeams streaming through the restored stained glass windows, illuminating the intricate woodwork I had painstakingly preserved. Patricia, I need to discuss the Whitfield engagement party, I said, pulling up the contract on my computer. Is there a problem, Ms. Kovac? She asked, concern evident in her expression. She had worked enough events to know that last-minute issues could cascade into disasters. Not with the event itself, I assured her. But I need you to know something. The groom is my brother-in-law. David Whitfield is my husband. Her eyes widened in recognition. I had kept my personal life deliberately separate from my business, and most of my staff knew me only as Elena Kovac, the exacting but fair owner who occasionally appeared to oversee major events or complex restorations. Does the family know you own the property? Patricia asked carefully. No, I said. And I don't want them to know. Not yet. Continue handling everything exactly as you would for any other client. I trust you completely to make their event flawless. She nodded slowly, professional discretion keeping her from asking the obvious questions about why I would keep such significant information from my own family. I'll make sure everything is perfect, she promised. The party is in 3 weeks. Do you plan to attend? That's still being decided, I said vaguely, not ready to share the full humiliation of being uninvited from an event at my own property. Over the following days, I went through the motions of normal life while something fundamental shifted inside me. I attended a site meeting for a new restoration project, reviewed architectural plans for a historic schoolhouse conversion, met with craftsmen about reproducing original tile work. But underneath the professional competence I projected, I was reassessing everything I thought I knew about my marriage and my worth. David seemed oblivious to my emotional withdrawal, or perhaps he was simply relieved that I wasn't making issues about the party invitation. He continued his usual routine, working late at his father's firm, attending family dinners without me when they coincided with my project deadlines, maintaining the comfortable fiction that his wife was a hobbyist who dabbled in old buildings. 1 week before the engagement party, Caroline sent me a lengthy text message about how stressed she was with final preparations. The florist is being difficult about the centerpieces, and the caterer wants to charge extra for the vintage champagne service, and the venue coordinator keeps asking questions about timing that I don't have answers for. Can you imagine? All this money we're spending and they can't just figure things out? I stared at the message, at the casual complaint about my staff who were working overtime to accommodate her constant changes and unrealistic demands. She had no idea that every question Patricia was asking was designed to ensure Caroline got exactly what she wanted, that the difficult negotiations with vendors were me personally calling in favors and absorbing costs to make her vision reality. I'm sure they're doing their best, I replied neutrally. These details always seem overwhelming, but they usually work out. She responded with a series of stress emojis and a comment about how people who work in these venues just don't understand the pressure of planning a high society event. The casual dismissal of my staff, of the expertise and care they brought to their work, crystallized something that had been building in me for weeks. I was done shrinking myself. Done accepting crumbs of respect. Done allowing my accomplishments to be erased for someone else's comfort. The question was what to do about it. The evening before Caroline's engagement party, I stood alone in the grand ballroom of the Whitmore estate, running my hand along the restored oak wainscoting that had taken 3 months to properly refinish. The space glowed in the soft light of the original crystal chandeliers, each one painstakingly rewired and restored to working condition. Tomorrow this room would be filled with the Whitfield family and their society friends, all of them celebrating in a space I had brought back from the edge of ruin, none of them knowing I was the one who had made it possible. Patricia found me there, her heels clicking softly on the parquet floor I had spent weeks researching to ensure we matched the original 1890s pattern. The setup crew had just finished, she reported, pulling up her tablet to show me photos of the room arrangements. Everything is exactly as the bride requested. The centerpieces arrived an hour ago and they're stunning. She swiped through images of elaborate floral arrangements featuring rare blooms that I knew had cost a small fortune, a cost I had quietly absorbed into the venue fee without Caroline ever knowing. It looks perfect, I said, studying each detail. You and the team have done exceptional work. Patricia hesitated, then asked quietly, will you be attending tomorrow? As a guest, I mean. The question hung in the air between us. She knew enough of the situation to understand the complexity, the strange position I found myself in as both the uninvited family member and the property owner orchestrating every detail of the celebration that had excluded me. I haven't decided, I told her, which was only partially true. I had decided, but I wasn't ready to share my plan with anyone yet. What I did know was that I would no longer hide who I was or what I had built. Whether that revelation happened tomorrow or later, it was coming. The days of allowing David and his family to minimize my accomplishments were over. Patricia nodded, professional enough not to press further, and left me alone with my thoughts in the ballroom that represented everything I had worked for. That night, David came home late from his parents' house where he had been helping with some last-minute party preparations. He found me in our living room, sitting in the dark, looking out at the city lights. "You're still up," he said, surprised. "I thought you'd be asleep by now." "Couldn't sleep," I replied without turning around. "Big day tomorrow." "Right, the party," he said, and I heard the relief in his voice that I wasn't going to bring up my exclusion again. "I'm sure Caroline appreciates how understanding you've been about the whole guest list situation." "Understanding," I repeated, the word tasting bitter. "Is that what you think this is?" "Elena, please," he sighed. "Can we not do this tonight? I'm exhausted and tomorrow is already going to be stressful enough." I turned to look at him then, really look at him in a way I hadn't in months. "When did you become someone who was okay with treating me like I don't matter?" I asked. "When did my feelings become something you find inconvenient rather than important?" "That's not fair," he protested. "You matter to me. It's just that family dynamics are complicated and sometimes we have to make compromises." "Compromises," I said softly. "Is that what you call 7 years of hiding who I am? 7 years of letting your family think I'm some amateur decorator playing at a career instead of recognizing that I built something significant?" He looked genuinely confused, as if he couldn't understand why I was suddenly making an issue of arrangements that had seemed to work fine for years. "My family respects you," he insisted. "They just come from a different world where women don't usually." He stopped, perhaps realizing how his sentence was going to end. Don't usually what? I prompted. Own companies? Make their own money? Have careers that don't revolve around supporting their husbands? His silence was answer enough. I stood up, suddenly too tired to continue the conversation. I'm going to bed. We can talk about this after the party if you want, but I think we both need to seriously consider whether this marriage is working for either of us. The shock on his face suggested he had never actually considered that possibility, that I might be the one to question our relationship rather than simply accepting whatever scraps of recognition he chose to offer. Elena, you can't be serious. We're happy. We have a good life together. Do we? I asked. Or do you have a good life with a wife who stays small and manageable while I have a life of constant compromise and invisibility? I left him standing there and went to our bedroom, locking the door behind me for the first time in our marriage. Sleep came in fragments, my mind cycling through scenarios for the next day. I could simply not attend, could stay away and let David and his family have their celebration without the complication of my presence. That would be the path of least resistance, the choice that avoided confrontation and maintained the status quo. Or I could attend as planned, could show up as the owner of the venue and force them to finally see me as I actually was. That option felt both terrifying and necessary, a line in the sand that would fundamentally change my relationship with David and his family. By morning, I had made my decision. I dressed with care in a tailored charcoal suit that walked the line between professional and elegant, paired with the diamond earrings my grandmother had left me. Looking at myself in the mirror, I saw Elena Kovac, the woman who had saved 12 historic buildings from destruction, who employed 40 people across her various properties, who had been featured in architectural magazines and won preservation awards. That woman deserved to be seen, and today she would be. David had already left for his parents' house to help with early preparations when I came downstairs. He had left a note on the kitchen counter saying he would see me that evening and suggesting we could have a quiet dinner at home to talk. The assumption that I would be home, excluded from the festivities, rather than at the party strengthened my resolve. I called Patricia to let her know I would be arriving at the venue early to personally oversee the final preparations, my standard practice for major events regardless of my connection to the hosts. The Whitmore estate looked magnificent in the afternoon light, the gardens I had restored to their 1890s glory in full spring bloom. The caterers were already setting up in the kitchen, and the florist was making final adjustments to the arrangements throughout the house. I moved through the spaces I knew so intimately, checking details and speaking quietly with vendors, invisible in my professional capacity just as I had been invisible as David's wife. The irony wasn't lost on me. Patricia briefed me on the timeline. Guests would begin arriving at 6 for cocktails in the garden, followed by dinner in the ballroom at 7:30, and then dancing and speeches would continue into the evening. The Whitfield family had arranged for a photographer and videographer to document everything, and Caroline had mentioned something about live streaming portions of the event for her social media followers. Everything was precisely orchestrated for maximum elegance and social media impact. At 5:30, as the staff was doing final preparations, I heard voices in the main foyer. I recognized Margaret's imperious tone giving directions to someone about where to put gifts, and Caroline's higher-pitched excitement as she entered the building. They had come early to do a final walk through and ensure everything met their standards. I stayed in my office just off the main hall, door slightly ajar, listening to them move through the spaces I had created. "This is absolutely perfect," Caroline gushed. "Preston's mother is going to be so impressed. The Montgomerys have seen everything, but they've never been here." Margaret's voice carried from the ballroom. "The restoration work is quite good. Whoever did it had excellent taste." I bit back a laugh at the backhanded compliment. If only she knew that whoever had done it was her daughter-in-law, the woman with the cute little hobby she had dismissed for 7 years. I emerged from my office and walked into the ballroom where Caroline and Margaret were examining the table settings. Both women turned, surprise registering on their faces at my presence. "Elena," Margaret said, her tone making my name sound like an accusation. "What are you doing here? I thought you had a work conflict." "I do have work," I replied smoothly. "I'm here for work." Confusion crossed both their faces. "I don't understand," Caroline said slowly. "Did David send you to check on something?" Not exactly, I said. I'm here in my professional capacity as the owner of the Whitmore estate. The silence that followed was profound. Margaret's expression moved through several stages, from disbelief to shock to something that might have been embarrassment. Caroline's mouth actually fell open, her phone slipping slightly in her hand as she processed what I had said. That's impossible, Margaret finally managed. You work in interior design. You can't possibly own this property. I pulled out my phone and brought up the property deed, which I kept digitized for quick reference. As you can see, I said, turning the screen so they could read it, Kovac Restoration Architecture LLC owns the Whitmore estate. I'm the sole proprietor of that company. I purchased this property 3 years ago when it was on the verge of collapse and spent 2 years and $3 million restoring it to what you see now. Caroline was scrolling frantically through her phone, presumably looking up my company. Oh my God, she whispered. You're that Elena Kovac. The one from Architectural Digest. The one who saved the Morrison Theater. The same, I confirmed. I've been doing this work for 12 years. I own 7 historic properties that I've restored and currently operate as event venues and boutique hotels. The Whitmore estate is my flagship property. Margaret had gone very pale, clearly doing rapid calculations about the implications. Does David know? She asked, and there was an accusation in the question, as if I had been hiding this information from her son rather than the other way around. David has always known exactly what I do, I said carefully. But he made the choice not to share that information with you, to introduce me as someone who works in interior design rather than as the CEO of a successful restoration company. I went along with that choice for far too long because I thought I was being supportive. Now I realize I was just being complicit in my own erasure. The look that passed between Margaret and Caroline spoke volumes. They were reassessing everything they thought they knew about me, about their family dynamics, about the past 7 years of casual dismissals and condescending remarks. Before either of them could respond, David arrived with his father Richard and Caroline's fiancé Preston. The 3 men were laughing about something, clearly in good spirits, completely unaware of the tension crackling in the ballroom. When David saw me, he froze mid-step. Elena, what are you doing here? He asked, and I could hear the panic underlying his question. He knew my presence meant something had shifted, that the careful walls he had built to keep his professional wife separate from his family were crumbling. I work here, I said simply. David, your wife just told us she owns this property, Margaret said, her voice tight. She owns this entire estate. Is that true? David's face went through a series of expressions, landing somewhere between resignation and fear. Yes, he said quietly. Elena owns the Whitmore estate. She owns several historic properties. His father Richard stepped forward, his business mind clearly working through the implications faster than the others. Several properties, he repeated. How many exactly and what kind of valuation are we discussing? 7 properties currently, I replied, meeting his gaze steadily. Combined portfolio value of approximately $42 million, with annual revenues in the $8 million range. My firm also consults on restoration projects we don't own, which adds another $2 million in consulting fees. Richard whistled low. That's not interior design work. That's a serious business operation. Indeed it is, I agreed. And one I've been building since before I met David, growing it steadily while being introduced to all of you as someone who does a little decorating on the side. Preston, who had been silent until now, spoke up with genuine curiosity. Why the secrecy? If you've built something that impressive, why not own it publicly? I turned to David, giving him the opportunity to answer that question himself. He looked trapped, caught between his family's expectations and the truth he had been avoiding. Because I asked her not to, he finally admitted. When we first started dating, I asked Elena to downplay her success because I thought my family wouldn't understand a woman who out-earned me, who had built something more significant than what I was doing at the family firm. The confession hung in the air, shocking in its honesty. Margaret looked stricken, perhaps seeing for the first time how her own attitudes about women and careers had contributed to this situation. Caroline had gone very quiet, her phone forgotten in her hand. Richard looked disappointed, though whether in David or the situation itself was unclear. "And you went along with this?" Richard asked me. "For 7 years you let us believe you were something you weren't?" "I wouldn't phrase it that way," I said carefully. "I let you believe what David told you because I thought I was being a supportive wife. I thought that eventually he would be comfortable enough to tell you the truth, that our relationship was strong enough to withstand you knowing the full scope of my success. I was wrong on both counts." David's expression was pained. "Elena, I never meant to hurt you. I was just trying to make things easier, to avoid the kind of judgment and comparison that I knew would happen." "Easier for whom?" I asked. "Certainly not easier for me to sit through years of patronizing conversations about my little hobby. Not easier to be excluded from family business discussions as if I don't run a business myself. Not easier to be uninvited from this party because apparently I'm not important enough to warrant a spot on the guest list." Caroline gasped. "You weren't coming because of the guest list?" "Oh God, Elena, I had no idea. I thought you had a work conflict like David said." "There was no work conflict," I said quietly. "David told you that to cover for the fact that he agreed I should be cut from the guest list. He chose to exclude me rather than fight for me to be included, and then he lied about why I wouldn't be attending." The raw hurt in my voice surprised even me. I had thought I had processed this betrayal, had moved past it to anger and resolve. But standing here in front of his family, admitting how thoroughly David had chosen them over me, the wound felt fresh and deep. David tried to step toward me, but I held up a hand. "Don't. Just don't. You've made your choices very clear over the past 7 years. Tonight was just the most obvious example of a pattern that's been there all along." I turned to Caroline. "Your party will go on exactly as planned. My staff is the best in the business and they will make sure everything is flawless. You won't even know I'm here." "But you are here," Preston said, speaking with a directness I appreciated. "You own the building, you restored it, you're the reason we can have this celebration at all. Seems like you should be acknowledged for that." Margaret had finally recovered enough to speak, though her usual confidence was shaken. "Elena, I owe you an apology. We all do. If we had known who you were, what you had accomplished, we would have treated you very differently." "That's exactly the problem," I said, meeting her eyes. "You should have treated me with respect regardless of what I did for a living. I'm David's wife. That alone should have earned me better than what I got. But beyond that, David knew who I was. He knew what I had built. He chose to hide it from you because my success made him uncomfortable, and you never questioned that or pushed to know me better." The truth of that statement settled over the group like a weight. Richard put his hand on David's shoulder, a gesture that could have been support or disappointment or both. "Son, I think you and your wife need to have a serious conversation about your marriage. This isn't something that can be smoothed over with an apology and flowers." David nodded miserably, looking at me with something that might have been understanding dawning too late. "Elena, can we talk privately?" he asked. "Not right now," I said. "Right now you have a party to host and a sister to support on her engagement. We can talk tomorrow when emotions aren't running quite so high and we've both had time to think about what we really want." I looked around at the restored ballroom one more time, at the space I had poured so much of myself into creating. "Enjoy the party. Everything has been prepared to the highest standards because that's what I do." I turned and walked out of the ballroom, my heels clicking on the floor I had restored, passing through the foyer I had brought back to life, stepping out into the gardens I had researched and replanted according to historical plans. Patricia met me at my office door, clearly having heard enough through the walls to understand what had happened. "Are you all right?" she asked gently. "I'm not sure," I admitted. "But I'm done hiding who I am. That's something at least." The party went on as scheduled. Through my office windows and the security monitors I kept for property management, I could watch the guests arriving, the elegant minglings in the garden, the smooth transition to dinner service. My staff performed flawlessly, as I knew they would, creating an evening of seamless elegance and historic charm. No one looking at the celebration would have guessed at the drama that had unfolded just hours before, or at the owner sitting alone in her office watching her marriage potentially end. Around 8 o'clock, there was a knock on my office door. I expected Patricia or perhaps one of the catering staff with a question. Instead, it was Caroline, still in her cocktail dress but with a seriousness that replaced her earlier excitement. "Can I come in?" she asked tentatively. I nodded, gesturing to the chair across from my desk. She sat down, smoothing her dress nervously before meeting my eyes. "I've been horrible to you," she said without preamble. "For years, I've dismissed you and patronized you and treated you like you were beneath me, all because I believed what David told us about your career. That's on me for never bothering to get to know you better, for accepting his version without question." "I appreciate you saying that," I replied carefully, unsure where this was going. "Preston pointed out something after you left," Caroline continued. "He said that the way our family treated you, the way we dismissed your work and excluded you from conversations, that's exactly the kind of old-fashioned sexism that his mother deals with in her own family. He said he wouldn't marry into a family that treated people that way, that treated women that way." She took a shaky breath. It made me realize that I was becoming exactly like our mother, judging other women by whether they fit into our narrow definition of appropriate careers and appropriate ambitions. "That takes courage to recognize," I said. "Not everyone is willing to examine their own biases." "I don't want to be that person," she said firmly. "And I don't want my marriage to start with this kind of dishonesty and dismissiveness toward family. So I came to ask if you would please join the party. Not as the venue owner, though obviously we're grateful for everything you've done to make this beautiful. But as my sister-in-law, as family." The invitation surprised me with its sincerity. "What does David think about this?" I asked. "I didn't ask him," Caroline said. "This is my engagement party and Preston's. We get to decide who we want here. And we want you there." She paused. "I know you and David have bigger things to work out, things that my party probably made worse. But that's between you two. Tonight, I just want to try to start over, to treat you the way I should have from the beginning." I looked at this young woman who had been thoughtless and dismissive but who was now making a genuine effort to do better. Growth isn't instant or easy, but it has to start somewhere. "All right," I said. "Give me 20 minutes to change into something more appropriate for a party." Caroline's face lit up with relief. "Thank you. And Elena, I really am sorry. For all of it." After she left, I sat for a moment considering my options. I could stay in my office, could maintain the boundary I had set. Or I could accept this olive branch, could step into the party as myself, fully visible for perhaps the first time in my marriage. I thought about what I would tell younger Elena, the woman who had mortgaged everything to buy that first cottage, who had believed so fiercely in the value of preservation and restoration. I would tell her not to hide her light, not to shrink herself for anyone's comfort. I changed into the dress I kept in my office for unexpected formal occasions, a deep emerald silk that I had never worn around David's family because it felt too elegant, too much like owning my success. Tonight felt like exactly the right occasion to wear it. I touched up my makeup, straightened my shoulders, and walked out of my office toward the sound of music and conversation drifting from the ballroom. When I entered the party, the room was full of guests enjoying cocktails and conversation. The candlelight from the restored chandeliers cast everything in a warm glow, and the string quartet I had arranged was playing softly in the corner. Caroline saw me first and immediately came over, taking my arm and leading me toward where Preston stood with his parents. "Preston, Mom, Dad," she said warmly, "I want you to meet my sister-in-law properly. This is Elena Kovac, owner of this beautiful estate and founder of Kovac Restoration Architecture." Preston's mother, an elegant woman in her 60s, looked at me with interest and a hint of apology. "We heard about the unfortunate misunderstanding," she said carefully. "Caroline tells us you've done remarkable work in historic preservation. The Morrison Theatre restoration was yours, wasn't it? I saw it last year and it's absolutely stunning." "Thank you," I said, surprised by the genuine interest in her tone. The Morrison was a labor of love. Theaters from that era have such incredible acoustics and architectural details that we just don't build anymore. We launched into a conversation about historic preservation, building codes, and the challenges of maintaining historical accuracy while meeting modern safety standards. Preston's father, who owned commercial real estate, had thoughtful questions about financing restoration projects and the return on investment for historic properties versus new construction. It was the kind of substantive business conversation I had been excluded from at every previous Whitfield family gathering, and it felt both validating and bittersweet. David stood across the room with his parents, watching me talk with the Montgomerys. I could see the conflict in his expression, something that looked like pride warring with embarrassment and regret. When the conversation with Preston's family wound down, Margaret approached me, Richard at her side. "Elena," Richard said formally, "I hope you'll allow me to apologize properly. I've built my career on evaluating businesses and recognizing potential. The fact that I never bothered to learn what you actually did, never asked about your work beyond superficial pleasantries, that's a failure of judgment I'm not proud of." Margaret nodded, adding her own apology. "I've spent so much time in circles where women's careers are decorative rather than substantial. I made assumptions about you based on those experiences, and I'm sorry. What you've built is impressive by any measure, and you deserve to have that acknowledged." Their apologies felt more genuine than I had expected, tinged with the kind of discomfort that comes from recognizing your own prejudices. I accepted them with grace, knowing that real change would require more than words, but that words were at least a starting point. Throughout the evening, I found myself having the kinds of conversations I had imagined when I first married into this family. Preston's business associates asked intelligent questions about my work. Other guests who recognized my name from articles or preservation awards engaged with genuine interest. Caroline made a point of introducing me properly to everyone, emphasizing my professional accomplishments without being prompted. It was both wonderful and heartbreaking, this glimpse of what family gatherings could have been like all along if David had simply been proud of me instead of threatened. Around 10 o'clock, as the party was winding down and guests were beginning to say their goodbyes, David finally approached me. I was standing near one of the tall windows overlooking the garden, watching the last of the sunset fade into twilight. "Can we talk now?" he asked quietly. His earlier confidence had completely dissolved, leaving him looking tired and uncertain. "We can talk," I agreed, though I'm not sure what there is to say that hasn't already been said. He guided me out to the terrace where we could have privacy, away from the remaining guests and the staff beginning to clean up. The night air was cool and filled with the scent of the roses I had planted along the garden paths, carefully selected to match varieties that would have been available in the 1890s. Even now, standing in this space I had created, I felt a strange disconnect between my professional pride and my personal pain. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since this afternoon," David began, leaning against the stone balustrade. "About us, about how I've treated you, about what I've asked you to give up." "I never really saw it as giving up anything," I said. "You presented it as a temporary accommodation to make your family more comfortable. I thought it was a small sacrifice for the sake of our relationship." "But it wasn't small, was it?" he said. "And it wasn't temporary. I kept asking you to be smaller and quieter about your success because it made me feel better about my own mediocrity." "You're not mediocre," I said reflexively, the habit of building him up still strong after all these years. He gave me a sad smile. "That's kind of you to say, but we both know it's not true. I'm competent at what I do, but I'll never be exceptional. I'll never build something from nothing the way you have. I'll never have the vision or the drive or the courage to take the kinds of risks you've taken. And instead of dealing with that reality, instead of working on my own insecurities, I tried to diminish you to feel better about myself." The honest self-assessment was something I had never heard from him before. It stripped away the excuses and justifications, leaving only the raw truth of what our marriage had become. "So where does that leave us?" I asked. "I don't know," he admitted. "Where do you want it to leave us?" I looked out at the estate, at the gardens and the mansion illuminated by carefully placed lighting that highlighted its architectural features. "This place represents everything I believe in," I said slowly. "Taking something broken and neglected and breathing new life into it. Honoring what was valuable about the past while making it functional for the present. I wanted to believe our marriage could be like that we could restore what we had and make it stronger." "But," David prompted, hearing the unspoken word. "But restoration only works when the foundation is sound," I continued. "When the structure has integrity worth preserving. I'm not sure our marriage has that, David." I'm not sure it ever did. We fell in love quickly, maybe too quickly. I was ready for a personal life after years of focusing only on work, and you seemed genuinely interested in me. But looking back, I wonder if you were more interested in the idea of me than the reality. What do you mean? He asked, though I suspected he knew. You loved that I was independent and successful, I said, but only up to a point. Only as long as my success didn't exceed yours or challenge your sense of yourself. When it became clear that my career was outpacing yours in terms of financial success and public recognition, you couldn't handle it. Instead of being proud, you became resentful. Instead of celebrating my achievements, you hid them. He was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke his voice was thick with emotion. You're right. About all of it. I loved you, but I also needed you to stay small enough that I could feel big by comparison. That's not love, not really. That's just ego and insecurity dressed up as partnership. Hearing him acknowledge it should have felt like a victory, but instead it just felt sad. We had wasted 7 years on a relationship built on a fundamentally flawed foundation. I think we need some time apart, I said gently. Real time, not just a few days. I need to figure out who I am without constantly trying to fit into the narrow space you've created for me. And you need to figure out who you are without using me to make yourself feel inadequate. He nodded slowly, tears visible in his eyes even in the dim light. I don't want to lose you. But I understand that I already have, haven't I? I reached out and squeezed his hand briefly. I don't know what our future looks like. Maybe we find our way back to each other after we've both done the work we need to do individually. Maybe we don't. Either way, I can't keep being invisible in my own life. What do we tell people? He asked. Whatever version of the truth you're comfortable with, I said. I'm done hiding and lying and pretending. If you want to tell them we're separated, we can do that. If you want to tell them we're working through some issues, that's fine too. But I won't be part of any more cover stories designed to make you or your family feel more comfortable. He looked at me with something that might have been admiration mixed with regret. When did you get so strong? He asked. I've always been this strong, I replied. You just never wanted to see it. We stood in silence for a few more minutes, both of us processing the end or at least the transformation of our marriage. Finally, David went back inside to say goodnight to his family and help Caroline and Preston with the final hosting duties. I stayed on the terrace, alone with my thoughts in the building I had saved from ruin, wondering if I would be able to save myself with the same dedication and care. Patricia found me there 30 minutes later. The last guests have left, she reported. The cleanup crew is finishing up and should be done within the hour. Thank you, I said. You handled everything beautifully tonight. She hesitated, then asked, Are you staying here tonight? There are several guest suites made up if you need space. I considered the question. My home with David suddenly felt less like a sanctuary and more like another space where I had been playing a role. Yes, I think I will stay, I decided. The Gardenia suite if it's available. Of course, Patricia said. I'll make sure it's ready for you. She paused at the door. Ms. Kovac, if you don't mind me saying, what you did tonight took real courage. Not just confronting your husband and his family, but owning who you are without apology. A lot of people never find that kind of strength. Thank you, Patricia, I said, surprised by the emotion her words stirred in me. That means more than you know. After she left, I walked through the estate one more time, trailing my fingers along the restored woodwork, examining the careful details that most people would never notice but that made all the difference between a good restoration and a great one. In the library, I found Richard Whitfield standing by one of the bookshelves, reading the spines of the vintage books I had collected to fill the shelves with period-appropriate volumes. I started to back out, not wanting another confrontation, but he turned and saw me. Don't go, he said. I was actually hoping to talk to you. We settled into the leather chairs I had sourced from an estate sale, perfectly suited to the room's Victorian aesthetic. I owe you more than an apology, Richard began. I owe you an explanation, though it doesn't excuse anything. You don't owe me anything, I said. Yes, I do, he insisted. See, I built my business from nothing, just like you did. Started with a small investment firm in a rented office with 2 employees. Built it over 30 years into something respectable. I always told myself that when I had children, I would encourage them to do the same. To build something of their own, to take risks, to create rather than just manage. But when David showed interest in joining the firm, I was so pleased that I never pushed him to find his own path. He paused, choosing his words carefully. David is a good analyst, competent with clients, reliable in all the ways that matter for maintaining what's already been built. But he's not a builder. He doesn't have that spark of creation that you have, that I had at his age. I've known that for years, and instead of helping him find where he could excel, I let him stay in a role where he would always be adequate but never exceptional. That's on me as a father. And when he married someone who was a builder, I continued, understanding where this was going. Someone who had that spark, it highlighted what he wasn't. Exactly, Richard said. And rather than celebrating that you brought something into our family that we valued, rather than learning from you or supporting you, we all conspired to pretend you weren't what you so obviously were. Because it was easier than confronting uncomfortable truths about David and about our own biases regarding women and business. I've spent my entire career evaluating businesses, Richard continued. Assessing their potential, their leadership, their growth prospects. The fact that I never once asked to see your books, never inquired about your business model or your expansion plans, never treated you as the serious businesswoman you clearly are, that's not just discourtesy. That's willful blindness. And I'm ashamed of it. His honesty was unexpected and strangely moving. What you've built is impressive, I said. Your firm has a solid reputation. You have nothing to be ashamed of in your own accomplishments. Perhaps not, he agreed. But I have plenty to be ashamed of in how I raised my son to fear successful women instead of celebrating them, and in how I allowed my family to treat you. If you and David do separate, I hope you'll know that you're welcome in our family regardless. What you've done tonight, standing up for yourself and refusing to be diminished, that's exactly the kind of strength I wish I had encouraged in my own children. We talked for another hour, Richard sharing stories about building his business and the risks he had taken, the failures he had learned from, the moments of doubt when everything hung in the balance. It was the kind of conversation I had craved for years, a meeting of minds between people who understood the particular challenges and rewards of building something from nothing. When we finally said goodnight, he hugged me briefly and said, "Whatever happens with you and David, I hope you'll stay in touch. Our family could use more people like you, people who aren't afraid to tell us when we're wrong." I slept that night in the Gardenia suite, surrounded by the beauty I had created, in the building I had saved. My dreams were turbulent, mixing memories of the past 7 years with images of possible futures, some with David and many without him. Morning came with sunlight streaming through the tall windows, and I woke to find a text from my best friend Tara, who I had called the night before to give her a brief update. "You did it. You finally stood up for yourself. So proud of you. Come over for brunch when you're ready to process everything. Also, David called me asking how to win you back, which shows how clueless he still is if he thinks grand gestures will fix this." I smiled at her message, grateful for a friend who had watched me shrink myself for years and had gently, persistently encouraged me to reclaim my full self. Over the next few weeks, David and I settled into a strange new normal. He moved into the guest room at our house per my request, giving us space to coexist while figuring out next steps. We were unfailingly polite to each other, discussing logistics and schedules with the careful courtesy of roommates rather than spouses. He started therapy, both individual sessions to work on his insecurities and couples counseling that I agreed to attend, though I was far from certain our marriage could be saved. In those therapy sessions, facilitated by a skilled counselor named Dr. Morrison, we unpacked years of dysfunctional patterns. David's deep-seated insecurities about measuring up to his father's success, his resentment of my achievements mixed with genuine love, his learned behavior that a man's worth was tied to being the primary earner and decision-maker in his relationship. My own patterns emerged too, my tendency to prioritize harmony over honesty, my fear that being fully seen would mean being rejected, my willingness to compromise essential parts of myself in the service of a relationship. The work was hard and often painful. There were sessions where we made progress, where David demonstrated real understanding of how his behavior had hurt me and where I acknowledged my own role in allowing the dynamic to continue. There were other sessions where we seemed to talk in circles, unable to bridge the fundamental gap between what we each needed from a partnership. Dr. Morrison never pushed us toward reconciliation or separation, instead helping us see clearly what our relationship actually was versus what we had wanted it to be. Meanwhile, my professional life flourished in ways it never had when I was hiding my success. I gave an interview to a business magazine about women in male-dominated fields like construction and historic preservation. I spoke at a preservation conference about sustainable restoration practices. I was approached by a documentary filmmaker interested in featuring the Whitmore Estate restoration in a series about saving historic buildings. Each opportunity felt like stepping more fully into myself, claiming space I had always deserved but had been too afraid or too accommodating to occupy. Caroline surprised me by reaching out regularly, inviting me to lunch and genuinely working to build a relationship based on who I actually was rather than who she had assumed I was. She was planning her wedding with Preston and asked if I would help her understand the historical significance of various venues they were considering, treating me as an expert rather than a convenient connection. We talked about more than just buildings and weddings, slowly developing the kind of sister bond that might have existed all along if we had both been willing to see each other clearly. Even Margaret made efforts, sending me articles about historic preservation she thought I might find interesting, asking thoughtful questions about my work when we saw each other at family dinners I occasionally attended. The change wasn't instant or complete, old habits and assumptions still surfaced sometimes, but the intent to do better was genuine. Richard invited me to lunch several times to discuss business, picking my brain about commercial real estate opportunities involving historic buildings and introducing me to potential investors interested in preservation projects. 3 months after the engagement party, I sat across from David in Dr. Morrison's office for what we both knew might be our final session. We had done the work, had both grown and changed in meaningful ways. David was genuinely working on his insecurities, had even started exploring career options outside his father's firm where he might find work that felt more authentic to his actual interests and skills. I had learned to advocate for myself consistently, to refuse to shrink to make others comfortable, to value my own worth independent of any relationship. But growth doesn't always lead to reconciliation. Sometimes it leads to clarity. "I love you," David said, his voice steady. "I love who you are, all of who you are, in a way I couldn't before. I'm proud of what you've built and I'm ashamed that I ever tried to hide it. If you're willing to try again, I promise I'll spend every day proving that I can be the partner you deserve." I looked at him, this man I had married with such hope, who had disappointed me so deeply and who was now genuinely trying to become someone better. "I love you too," I said honestly. "But I'm not sure love is enough anymore." The pain that crossed his face was real and deep. "What we had," I continued gently, "was built on a flawed foundation. You needed me to be smaller than I was, and I was willing to become smaller to keep the peace. We're both different people now, better people, but I don't know if who we are now actually fits together. Or if we've just grown in different directions." Dr. Morrison spoke up quietly. "Elena, what would you need from a relationship to feel like it was working? What would partnership look like for you?" I thought about the question carefully. "I would need complete honesty," I said. "No more hiding who I am or what I do to make someone else comfortable. I would need a partner who celebrates my success without feeling diminished by it, who sees my achievements as something that adds to our life together rather than something that takes away from theirs. I would need someone who chooses me, who fights for me to be included rather than making excuses for my exclusion. I would need equality, true equality, where we both bring our whole selves to the relationship without one of us having to shrink." "Can you be that person, David?" I asked, turning to face him directly. "Not can you try, not do you want to be, but can you actually be that person? Because I spent 7 years believing you would eventually get there, that your discomfort was temporary and would pass once you felt more secure. I can't spend another 7 years hoping for change that might never come." He was quiet for a long time, and I appreciated that he was really considering the question rather than rushing to make promises he might not be able to keep. "I want to be," he finally said. "I'm working to be. But I'm honest enough now to admit that I don't know if I can get there completely." My instinct when you have a success is still to compare it to my lack of equivalent achievement. I'm working on changing that instinct, but it's so ingrained that I can't promise I'll never struggle with it again. His honesty, painful as it was, felt like a gift. It was the kind of truthfulness that our relationship had lacked for most of its existence. I appreciate you being real with me, I said. And I think that honesty tells us what we need to know. We've both grown, we're both becoming better versions of ourselves. But maybe we're not meant to do that growth together anymore. Maybe we're meant to take what we've learned and build different futures. The tears that ran down both our faces weren't the dramatic sobs of sudden heartbreak. They were the quieter grief of acknowledging that something we had both invested in, had both wanted to work, simply couldn't be forced into a shape it was never meant to hold. Over the following weeks, we navigated the logistics of separation with surprising grace. David moved into an apartment closer to downtown, giving us both physical space to match the emotional distance we had acknowledged. We divided our possessions thoughtfully, neither of us fighting over objects that had filled a home where neither of us had been fully ourselves. We worked with lawyers to handle the financial separation, and because I had always kept my business completely separate from our marriage, the complexity was less than it might have been. The Whitfield family, to their credit, didn't take sides or pressure either of us. They had done enough work of their own to recognize that the marriage's failure wasn't about villains and victims but about two people who had tried to build something on an unstable foundation. Caroline especially was supportive of both of us, maintaining her growing friendship with me while also being there for her brother as he processed the end of his marriage. 6 months after the engagement party that had catalyzed everything, I stood in the ballroom of the Whitmore estate hosting an event for the State Historic Preservation Office. The room was filled with architects, preservationists, city planners, and historians, people who understood and valued the work I did. I was giving a presentation about sustainable restoration practices and innovative financing models for preservation projects. As I spoke, gesturing to the restored details around us as examples, I felt completely at home in my expertise, owning my knowledge and experience without apology or qualification. After the presentation, a young woman approached me shyly. She introduced herself as a recent architecture school graduate interested in historic preservation but unsure how to break into the field. We talked for nearly an hour, me sharing the story of how I had started, the risks I had taken, the failures I had learned from, the persistence required to build something meaningful. I could see in her eyes the same spark I remembered feeling when I first discovered this work, that sense of calling that couldn't be satisfied with anything less than full commitment. Before she left, I gave her my card and told her to reach out when she was ready to look for opportunities. People like us need to support each other, I said. There aren't enough of us willing to fight for these buildings, to see the value in preservation when demolition is easier. That night, alone in my office at the estate, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. The marriage that had ended, the family relationships that had transformed, the professional recognition I had finally allowed myself to fully claim. I pulled out my phone and composed a message to David. Thank you for being honest enough to let me go. I hope you find what you're looking for, and I hope it's something that makes you feel complete without needing anyone else to be less. You deserve that. His response came a few minutes later. Thank you for being strong enough to demand more than I could give. Watching you finally step fully into who you are has been painful but also inspiring. I hope I can find that kind of courage for myself. It was a fitting end to our relationship, honest and kind without pretending the past hadn't hurt or that the future would include each other. I had loved him, had built a life with him, and now I was building a new life without him. Both could be true. The work of restoration, whether of buildings or of self, isn't about returning things to exactly how they were. It's about honoring what was valuable from the past while adapting for a sustainable future. It's about structural integrity, about making sure the foundation can support what you're building. It's about being willing to tear down what's unsound and rebuild it properly, even when that's harder than simply covering up the problems. A year after the engagement party, I received a wedding invitation from Caroline and Preston. The ceremony would be held at the Whitmore estate, of course, and this time my name was on the invitation without qualification or hesitation. The RSVP card asked if I would bring a guest, a question that made me smile. I had been on a few dates in recent months, carefully exploring what I wanted from a relationship now that I understood more clearly who I was and what I wouldn't compromise. There was no one serious yet, no one I wanted to bring to a family wedding, but I felt open to possibility in a way I hadn't in years. I checked the box for one guest, just myself, and added a note congratulating them both. When the wedding day arrived, I dressed carefully in a sage green dress that made me feel elegant and powerful. I drove to the estate I owned, parked in the private lot reserved for family, and walked into the building I had saved with my own determination and vision. Caroline saw me immediately and rushed over, radiant in her wedding gown. "Elena, you're here. I'm so glad." "I wouldn't miss it," I said honestly, hugging her carefully to avoid crushing her dress. "You look absolutely beautiful." She lowered her voice, glancing around to make sure we wouldn't be overheard. "David is here with someone. I wanted you to know before you saw them. He's been seeing her for a few months. I just didn't want it to be a shock." I appreciated the warning and the care behind it. "Thank you for telling me. I'm genuinely happy if he's found someone who makes him happy." And it was true, to my own surprise. Seeing David later with his new girlfriend, a woman who worked in marketing and seemed completely comfortable with herself, I felt no jealousy or regret. Just a quiet hope that he had learned enough from our relationship to build something healthier this time. He saw me watching and came over, his girlfriend at his side. "Elena," he said warmly, "I'd like you to meet Jessica." "Jessica, this is Elena, my ex-wife and the remarkable woman who owns this estate." The introduction, giving me my full identity without minimization, felt like a small miracle. We chatted briefly, cordially, the awkwardness less than I had feared. Before they moved on, David touched my arm gently. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for not settling for less than you deserved. It made me have to face my own shortcomings, and that's led me somewhere better." "I'm glad," I said, and meant it. We both deserved to be in relationships where we could be fully ourselves. The ceremony was beautiful, conducted in the garden I had restored with Caroline and Preston exchanging vows under an arch of flowers. The reception that followed filled the ballroom with laughter and music and the kind of joy that comes from genuine celebration. I danced with Richard, who told me about David's new position at a different investment firm where he was apparently thriving in a role that played to his actual strengths rather than trying to fill his father's shoes. I danced with Caroline's new father-in-law, who wanted to discuss a potential historic property he was considering for development and valued my expertise. As the evening wound down, I found myself on the terrace where David and I had had our crucial conversation a year earlier. Margaret joined me, 2 glasses of champagne in hand, offering me one. "To new beginnings," she said, raising her glass. "For all of us." "To new beginnings," I echoed, touching my glass to hers. We stood in comfortable silence for a moment before Margaret spoke again. "I've been thinking about what you said that night, about how we should have treated you with respect regardless of your career. You were absolutely right. I built my whole life around the idea that my worth came from my husband's success, and I passed that toxic idea on to my children. It's never too late to change," I said gently. "Look at how far Caroline has come." Margaret nodded. "She's marrying a man who insisted we all attend a workshop on unconscious bias and family dynamics before the wedding. Apparently that was his condition for joining our family, that we all commit to doing better." I laughed at that. "Preston is good for her. They're good for each other. That's what partnership should be," Margaret said thoughtfully. 2 people making each other better, not one person shrinking to make the other feel bigger. "I'm sorry we modeled the wrong thing for David, and I'm sorry we tried to force you into that same broken mold. You're doing the work now," I said. "That's what matters." We talked for another hour, Margaret sharing stories about her own mother's constrained life, the expectations and limitations that had been passed down through generations of Whitfield women. She had rebelled by marrying Richard and focusing on charity work, but she had never questioned the fundamental assumption that her role was to support rather than to build. "Watching you build your company while maintaining grace even when we were awful to you," she said, "that taught me something important. Women can be strong and kind, ambitious and caring, successful and generous. Those things aren't contradictory." As I drove home that night, alone but not lonely, I thought about the journey from that first restored cottage to this moment. The buildings I had saved, the business I had built, the relationships I had transformed or released. Every step had required courage, the willingness to take risks and face failures, the strength to keep going when obstacles seemed insurmountable. But the hardest restoration project hadn't been any building. It had been reclaiming myself, rebuilding my sense of worth and identity after years of allowing both to be minimized. The Whitmore estate stood illuminated in my rearview mirror as I drove away, a testament to what could be achieved when you refuse to accept that something beautiful and valuable should be lost just because restoring it would be difficult. I had saved that building from collapse, and in the process, I had saved myself from a different kind of collapse, the slow erosion of self that comes from hiding your light to make others comfortable. My phone buzzed with a text from Tara. How was the wedding? Did you survive seeing David with his new girlfriend? Come over tomorrow and tell me everything. Also, I have someone I want you to meet, another architect who just moved to town and shares your passion for historic preservation. No pressure, just drinks with a potentially interesting person. I smiled at her persistent matchmaking, her refusal to let me close myself off to possibility even as I was still healing from the end of my marriage. Maybe I would meet Tara's architect friend. Maybe something would come of it, or maybe not. Either way, I was open to connection in a way that felt healthy rather than desperate, excited about possibility rather than afraid of being alone. The future stretched ahead, full of buildings to save and stories to tell and spaces to create. My next project was a 1920s Art Deco theater that had been abandoned for 15 years, another impossible restoration that everyone said couldn't be done. I had already bought the property and assembled my team, and we would break ground on the restoration in a few weeks. People asked why I kept taking on these challenging projects, why I didn't focus on easier renovations that would be more profitable and less stressful. The answer was simple. These buildings deserved to be saved, deserved someone who could see past the decay to the beauty and value underneath. They deserved someone who wouldn't give up when the work got hard, who would honor their history while adapting them for the future. They deserved what I had finally learned to demand for myself, to be seen fully and valued completely, without apology or compromise. Standing in my own kitchen that night, making tea in the house I had bought for myself after the separation, I felt a profound sense of peace. The journey hadn't been easy. I had lost a marriage, had spent years invisible in my own life, had allowed my worth to be determined by people who couldn't see it clearly. But I had also built something extraordinary, had saved irreplaceable pieces of history, had learned to demand the respect and recognition I deserved. The woman who had shrunk herself to fit into David's limited vision was gone, restored and rebuilt into someone stronger, someone who knew her own value and wouldn't negotiate it away. My phone lit up with an email notification, a message from the young architect I had met at the preservation event months earlier. She had just landed her first restoration project and wanted to thank me for the encouragement and advice I had offered. Reading her excitement reminded me of my younger self, standing in that first cottage with vision and determination and no idea how much the journey would cost or teach me. I wrote back immediately, offering to consult on her project if she needed guidance, knowing how valuable it had been to have a mentor like Thomas when I was starting out. This was legacy too, not just the buildings I restored but the people I helped along the way, the knowledge I shared, the paths I cleared for those coming after me. David had wanted children, had envisioned a traditional family structure where I would naturally scale back my career to focus on parenting. I had wanted children too, but I had wanted them in the context of true partnership where both parents shared equally in career and family responsibilities. That difference, along with so many others, had been another crack in our foundation that we had never properly addressed. Now, at 41, I was reassessing what I wanted from the next chapter of my life. Maybe there would still be children, through adoption or partnership with someone who shared my values. Maybe there wouldn't, and my legacy would be the buildings I saved and the people I mentored and the standards I set for what women in my field could achieve. Both futures felt possible and valid in ways they hadn't when I was trying to fit myself into someone else's vision of what my life should look like. The following morning, I met Tara for breakfast at our favorite cafe, the same place where I had told her years ago about David's proposal, where she had gently expressed concerns about how he talked about my career. I should have listened to you, I said over coffee. You saw the problems before I was willing to admit they existed. You weren't ready to hear it then, Tara said kindly. Sometimes we need to learn lessons for ourselves, even when friends try to warn us. But you got there eventually, and that's what matters. Plus, she added with a mischievous smile, you got a gorgeous historic estate out of it, so not a total loss. I laughed, grateful for her ability to find humor even in painful situations. Tell me about this architect you want me to meet, I said. What's his story? Her story, actually, Tara corrected. Dr. Simone Laurent. She just moved here from New Orleans where she was heading up the restoration of several French Quarter buildings. She's brilliant, funny, passionate about preservation, and yes, she's single. Before you protest, this is just drinks between people who share professional interests. If something else develops, great. If not, you'll have made a valuable professional connection. When I met Simone later that week at a wine bar downtown, I was immediately struck by her enthusiasm for historic architecture and her nuanced understanding of the challenges facing preservation in modern cities. We talked for 3 hours, trading stories about difficult restorations and impossible clients, debating approaches to sustainability in historic buildings, discussing the politics of preservation boards and funding. It was intellectually stimulating in a way I hadn't experienced in years, two experts in the same field finding common ground and challenging each other's assumptions. As we were saying goodbye, Simone mentioned she was looking for office space for her new consulting practice. On impulse, I told her about the carriage house on the Whitmore estate property that I had been considering converting into office space but hadn't gotten around to yet. If you're interested, we could talk about a partnership, I offered. You'd have beautiful workspace in a historic building, and I'd have a brilliant architect on site to consult on projects. Her eyes lit up with interest and we agreed to continue the conversation. Over the next several months, Simone and I developed a friendship that slowly, carefully evolved into something more. She understood the demands of my work because she shared them, celebrated my successes without feeling diminished by them, and challenged me intellectually in ways that made me better at what I did. When she kissed me for the first time, standing in the carriage house we were converting into her office, it felt like coming home to myself in a way my marriage never had. This is new for me, I admitted, my voice shaking slightly. Not the being with a woman part, I'd dated women before David, but the being with someone who sees all of me and wants all of me. That's not new, Simone said gently. That's just what love should be. We took things slowly, both of us cautious from past relationships that hadn't worked. But the foundation we were building felt solid, based on mutual respect and shared values and genuine appreciation for each other's whole selves. When I introduced her to the Whitfield family at a dinner 6 months later, describing her as my partner in both business and life, there was no hesitation in my voice. Richard and Margaret welcomed her warmly, asking intelligent questions about her work and making genuine efforts to include her in the conversation. Caroline pulled me aside at one point and whispered, "You look happy. Really happy, in a way you never quite did with David." "I am happy," I confirmed. Simone makes me want to be my fullest self, not a smaller version for anyone's comfort. "That's what you deserve," Caroline said firmly. "That's what we all deserve." The wedding invitation that arrived 2 years later, with both our names embossed in elegant script, felt like a full-circle moment. Simone and I were getting married in the grand ballroom of the Whitmore estate, the space where my previous life had unraveled and my new one had begun. The ceremony was small and intimate, just close friends and family who had supported us through our individual journeys and celebrated our joining together. Tara stood as my best woman, teasing me about how she had known all along that I just needed to find someone worthy of my awesomeness. Richard walked me down the aisle, a gesture that felt right given how much our relationship had evolved and healed. When Simone and I exchanged vows we had written ourselves, promising to celebrate each other's successes and support each other's growth and always make space for both of us to be fully ourselves, I felt the profound rightness of building something on a solid foundation. Our first dance was to a jazz standard from the 1920s, era appropriate for the building and symbolic of the history we both valued. As we moved together in the space I had restored, surrounded by people who saw and valued us both completely, I thought about the long journey from that first cottage to this moment. Every building I had saved had taught me something. The importance of strong foundations. The value of preserving what was beautiful from the past while adapting for the future. The necessity of doing the hard work of restoration rather than simply covering up problems. The courage required to take risks on something everyone else had written off as a lost cause. Those lessons had applied to more than just architecture. They had taught me how to save myself, how to restore my own sense of worth after years of erosion, how to build a life on a foundation solid enough to support my full weight and ambition. The Whitmore estate stood as testimony to what was possible when you refused to accept that something valuable should be lost just because saving it would be difficult. I had saved this building, and in the process, this building had saved me, had given me the space and the occasion to finally demand to be seen fully. As the reception continued into the evening, I stood on the terrace with Simone, watching the lights of the city sparkle in the distance. "Happy?" she asked, pulling me close. "Incredibly," I confirmed. All of this, it's everything I didn't know I could have." "You built it," she said simply. "The estate, the business, the courage to demand what you deserved. You built all of this, piece by piece, restoration by restoration." "I suppose I did," I agreed. "And I'm not done building yet. There are more historic properties to save, more young architects to mentor, more proof to offer that women can build empires while staying true to themselves." Simone kissed my temple gently. "That's my wife. Always 10 projects ahead and ready to save the world one historic building at a time." "It's not about saving the world," I protested laughingly. "It's about preserving what matters, what has value and beauty and history worth protecting." She smiled knowingly. Like I said, saving the world. The party continued around us, but we stayed on the terrace for a while longer, content in each other's presence and the life we were building together. The foundation was solid this time, built on truth and mutual respect and the freedom to be completely ourselves. Whatever we constructed on that foundation would last because it was built properly from the start. Years later, when architecture students and preservation advocates asked about the Whitmore estate and the story behind its restoration, I would tell them the whole truth. About buying a crumbling mansion everyone said couldn't be saved, about the years of painstaking work to bring it back to life, about using it as a venue for my brother-in-law's engagement party while my own marriage crumbled. About standing in this ballroom and finally claiming my full identity after years of hiding it. About meeting my wife here and eventually getting married in the same space where I had first demanded to be seen completely. The building and my personal journey had become inseparable, each one informing and reflecting the other. Students would ask if I regretted the years I spent diminished and invisible in my first marriage. My answer was always the same. Regret suggests wishing the past had been different, but the past made me who I am. Those difficult years taught me what I wouldn't accept, showed me the cost of compromising my identity for someone else's comfort. They made me appreciate what I have now in a way I might not have without that contrast. The only thing I wished I had done differently was to have stood up for myself sooner, to have demanded respect from the beginning rather than hoping it would eventually be offered. But even that lesson had value. It taught me to advise young women starting their careers to never hide their light, to insist on being seen fully from the first introduction, to choose partners who celebrate their success rather than feel threatened by it. My story, with all its pain and triumph, became a teaching tool, a cautionary tale and an inspiration wrapped into one narrative. The Whitmore estate continued to host weddings and events, each one celebrating love and commitment and new beginnings. But for me, it would always be more than just a venue. It was the place where I finally stopped hiding, where I restored not just a building but my own sense of self. It was where I learned that true partnership requires complete honesty and mutual celebration, where I discovered that the right person makes space for all of you rather than asking you to shrink. Most importantly, it was proof that restoration was possible, that what seemed broken beyond repair could be saved with enough dedication and skill and unwillingness to accept loss as inevitable. Standing in the grand ballroom years after that first confrontation with David and his family, watching another couple celebrate their love in the space I had created, I felt profound gratitude for the journey that had brought me here. The building had been saved, my sense of self had been restored, and I had built a life where I could be fully visible without apology or compromise. The foundation was solid, the structure sound, and everything built upon it would last because it was constructed with integrity and truth. That was the real legacy of the Whitmore estate and of my own restoration, not just the beauty of what was created but the strength of the foundation it stood upon. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.